Today, you're going to hear an intense and shocking story. When fake inspection officers showed up at our Texas ranch, one of them hit my wife because she refused to let him in. But what happened next? He regretted it in seconds. Get ready to hear the full story and the shocking twist. Two men in fake uniforms demanded entry to our ranch. Rebecca shut the gate and said, "Not coming in." One of them slapped her hard enough to send her tumbling down our stone steps. Watching my wife collapse, motionless on the ground, ignited something primal inside me. If someone attacked your spouse on your own property, what would your response be? I knew mine within 15 seconds. But let me begin at the start, because that Tuesday afternoon shattered everything we believed about our quiet ranch existence. The calm before. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly across our Texas property as I wrestled with the broken water pump behind our ranch house. 15 years of working this land had taught me one reliable truth. Machinery always fails on the hottest days. Today proved no exception. The metal surface was so hot, I needed thick gloves just to touch it. But Rebecca depended on the irrigation system for her vegetable garden. She'd been outside since sunrise, feeding our chickens and caring for the small cattle herd we maintain on the back 40 acres. If you're watching this from your own property, leave a comment below. I genuinely appreciate hearing how you handle equipment failures in this kind of weather. At precisely 3:15 that afternoon, the peaceful rhythm of ranch life shattered completely. A black pickup truck came roaring down our dirt access road, throwing up a massive dust cloud. The engine noise was all wrong for our quiet area. Aggressive, urgent, nothing like the measured pace we ranchers typically used. Rebecca glanced up from the chicken coop, shielding her eyes as the vehicle approached our main gate. I set down my wrench and straightened up, that familiar protective instinct awakening in my chest like a guard dog suddenly alert. The truck skidded to a stop outside our gate, spraying gravel everywhere. The driver's door swung open with purpose. Out stepped a man in his mid-20s wearing a black vest that seemed designed to look official. Everything about his appearance felt rehearsed, calculated. When he adjusted the vest, I caught a glimpse of a cheap plastic badge that looked like something ordered online for $20. Real compliance officers in Texas wore metal badges issued by the county. They certainly didn't show up in personal vehicles without proper identification or advance notice. "Afternoon, folks." His voice carried across our yard with force authority, but underneath the bravado, I detected nervous uncertainty. The sound of someone playing a role they hadn't quite mastered. "I'm with the Ranch Compliance Authority. Need to conduct a mandatory inspection of your livestock facilities today." He gestured toward the cattle pens behind our house, but his eyes kept darting back to the truck like he was following a predetermined script. That's when I noticed a second figure still sitting motionless in the passenger seat, wearing dark sunglasses despite being inside a vehicle with tinted windows. Normal ranchers would have exited immediately to introduce themselves, would have walked over to shake hands and chat about the weather. This guy stayed put like a sentinel, hands drumming nervously on the dashboard in a rhythm that suggested he was keeping watch rather than waiting patiently. Rebecca's challenge. Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the gate, stopping a good 10 feet away from the bars. Smart woman. She'd learned to trust her instincts over our years together, especially when something felt off about unexpected visitors. "What authority?" she called out, her voice steady but carrying an edge of suspicion I recognized. "I've never heard of any ranch compliance authority, and we've been ranching here for 15 years. The county agriculture department handles all inspections, and they always call ahead to schedule appointments." The man in the vest shifted uncomfortably. I saw him glance back at his silent companion with what looked like desperation. Whatever script he prepared for this encounter, Rebecca's direct questions clearly weren't part of the plan. His confidence wavered visibly, like an actor who'd suddenly forgotten his lines in the middle of a crucial scene. The more I studied his face and mannerisms, the more familiar he seemed in a way that made no sense. Something about the way he held his shoulders when challenged, the particular tilt of his head when thinking through a response. It nagged at me like a half-remembered song you hear in a store but can't quite place. I definitely hadn't seen him in any official capacity. I knew most of the county workers by name after 15 years, and they all knew Rebecca and me by reputation. "Ma'am, this is a mandatory procedure under the new livestock regulations that went into effect last month," he replied, deflecting her question without actually answering anything she'd asked. "We need immediate access to your rear facilities to ensure compliance with updated standards for cattle management." He took a deliberate step closer to our gate. I noticed something predatory in his movement, like someone testing boundaries rather than following proper procedure. The passenger door finally creaked open, and the second man emerged into the afternoon heat. He was older, maybe late 20s, wearing an identical black vest that looked just as fake as his partner's costume. But where the first guy tried to project confidence and authority, this one looked ready to bolt at the first sign of real trouble. His hand shook visibly as he positioned himself near the truck's rear, creating what looked suspiciously like a tactical formation. These were not compliance officers or any kind of legitimate authority figures. They were amateurs playing dress-up and not doing a particularly convincing job of it. The question that burned in my mind was simple but terrifying. What did two fake officers want with our ranch? And why were they willing to risk impersonating government officials to get it? The recognition. As the first man turned back to confer with his increasingly nervous companion, speaking in low, urgent whispers that carried just far enough for me to catch the anxiety in their voices, that familiar feeling about his appearance intensified into something approaching recognition. I'd seen that particular combination of arrogance and uncertainty before, that specific way of moving when someone was trying to channel authority they didn't actually possess. But not here on our ranch, not in any legitimate context that would explain their presence. When he turned back to face us with his jaw set in renewed determination, I caught a clear view of his profile in the afternoon sunlight. My heartbeat stuttered as recognition began to dawn, cold realization creeping up my spine like ice water. The shape of his nose, the aggressive set of his shoulders, even the way he unconsciously copied someone else's power stance. All suddenly familiar. I'd seen all of these mannerisms before, but not on him specifically. My breath caught in my throat as the pieces clicked together with terrible clarity. The resemblance was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. And suddenly, this wasn't just about fake compliance officers anymore. This was something much more personal and infinitely more dangerous than random scammers trying to intimidate rural property owners. The familiar mannerisms, the way he carried himself, the particular brand of entitled aggression, it all pointed to a connection that made my blood run cold. This wasn't a random encounter. Someone had sent these amateurs to our ranch specifically, and I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly who was behind it. The question was no longer what they wanted. It was how far they were willing to go to get it, and what that meant for Rebecca and me on our own property. The tactical positioning. The tactical positioning became obvious within seconds. Both men moved with calculated precision that had nothing to do with legitimate compliance work and everything to do with intimidation. The first guy approached our main gate directly while his nervous companions circled around toward the back of our property line in a textbook flanking maneuver designed to make us feel surrounded and eliminate any sense of safe retreat. These were not bureaucrats conducting routine inspections. They were predators testing our defenses. My jaw tightened involuntarily as I watched their coordinated movement. Rebecca's posture shifted beside me, her shoulders squaring in that particular way that meant she was shifting from cautious to defensive. 15 years of marriage had taught me to read those subtle changes in her body language. Right now, every line of her stance screamed that she recognized the threat these men represented. She moved toward our front porch, positioning herself closer to our house and the security camera system I'd installed last year. "Ma'am, we really need your cooperation here," the first man continued, his voice taking on a harder edge that dropped any pretense of polite professionalism. "These new regulations from the board require immediate compliance checks, and resistance only makes the process more complicated for everyone involved." The way he emphasized certain words felt rehearsed, like he was reciting lines from a script someone else had written. But more disturbing was his casual reference to the board without specifying which board or what authority they claimed to represent. The second man had completed his positioning near our back gate, effectively cutting off our retreat route to the livestock facilities. From his position, he could observe our entire operation while maintaining the psychological pressure of being watched from multiple angles. His nervous energy was pronounced, hands fidgeting with something in his vest pocket that could have been another fake badge or something more concerning. "Which board?" Rebecca called out, her voice steady but carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who wouldn't be intimidated on her own property. "The County Agricultural Board? The State Livestock Commission?" Because I know the people who work for both agencies, and they don't conduct surprise inspections without proper documentation and advance notice. They certainly don't split up and surround private property like you two are doing right now. The first man's confident facade cracked slightly at her direct challenge. His eyes darted toward his companion, and I caught a flash of panic before he managed to reassemble his authoritative expression. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside so we can proceed with this mandatory inspection. The longer you delay this process, the more complicated the paperwork becomes for your compliance record." The escalation. My breathing grew shallow as I recognized the escalating nature of their tactics. The nervous energy radiating from the second man was becoming more obvious as the confrontation continued. From my position near the water pump, I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the afternoon breeze, and his constant fidgeting suggested he was way out of his comfort zone. Whatever arrangement had brought him to our ranch today, he was clearly having second thoughts about impersonating government officials on private property in rural Texas. "I want to see your identification and documentation," Rebecca demanded, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Real identification, not those plastic badges you're carrying. I want to see government-issued credentials, official paperwork authorizing this inspection, and contact information for your supervisors. Right now, before you take another step onto our property." The script they prepared clearly didn't include responses to direct challenges about their authority. The first man's confident demeanor continued to deteriorate under Rebecca's questioning, while his partner looked increasingly like he wanted to abandon the mission entirely. Their inexperience with actual confrontation was becoming apparent with each passing moment, suggesting that whoever had sent them here had seriously underestimated both our willingness to resist and our familiarity with proper legal procedures. "Ma'am, you're making this much harder than it needs to be," the first man replied, but his voice lacked the conviction it carried earlier. "We have the authority to conduct these inspections under the new regulations, and your resistance is being noted in our report. I strongly advise you to cooperate before the situation escalates beyond a simple compliance check." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and it triggered something primal in my protective instincts. Nobody threatened my wife on our own property, especially not fake officials with plastic badges and rehearsed intimidation tactics. I straightened up from my position near the water pump, making sure both men could see that I was paying attention to every word. The wrench in my hand suddenly felt heavier, more significant, though I had no intention of using it unless they crossed a line from harassment to actual physical threat. The second man caught my movement, and immediately looked even more nervous than before. His hand moved toward what I now realized was probably a communication device in his vest pocket, suggesting they had backup or supervision monitoring this encounter from somewhere nearby. The coordination level implied more organization than a simple scam, more planning than opportunistic criminals would typically invest in targeting a single ranch property. The muscles in my shoulders tensed as I watched him fumble with whatever device he was carrying. Rebecca positioned herself where she could quickly access our house and the landline telephone if the situation deteriorated further. Her movements were deliberate and controlled, designed to maintain defensive positioning without appearing to retreat or show weakness. "I'm going to give you one more opportunity to provide legitimate documentation of your authority," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone drawing a final line in the sand. "If you cannot produce proper credentials in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to ask you to leave our property immediately and not return without a court order or proper law enforcement escort." The ultimatum hung in the air between us like a challenge, and I could see both men struggling to decide how to respond. Their script had clearly not prepared them for this level of resistance from property owners who knew their rights and were willing to enforce them. The next 30 seconds would determine whether this remained a war of words or escalated into something far more serious and potentially dangerous for everyone involved. My heart was beating harder now, adrenaline beginning to flow, as I recognized that we were approaching a critical decision point where these men would either retreat or double down on their intimidation campaign. The familiar weight of the wrench in my hand reminded me that I was prepared to defend my wife and our property if they chose escalation over retreat. But I hoped their inexperience and obvious nervousness would convince them to abandon whatever mission had brought them to our ranch today. The countdown had begun. 30 seconds to see if these amateurs would back down, or if they would force us to discover just how far they were willing to take their dangerous charade on our own land. The afternoon air felt electric with tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Every instinct I developed over 15 years of protecting this ranch was screaming that we were about to cross a line from which there would be no peaceful return. The 30 seconds ticked by like an eternity. Neither man produced any legitimate documentation, any real credentials, any proof whatsoever that they had the authority to be on our property making demands. Instead, they exchanged another one of those nervous glances that confirmed everything Rebecca and I already suspected. These were imposters, caught in a deception with nowhere to hide. Rebecca stepped forward with renewed confidence, her hand firmly gripping the iron gate that separated our private property from the dirt road where these men had no right to make demands. "Your 30 seconds are up," she announced clearly, her voice carrying across the afternoon air with absolute authority. "I'm asking you to leave our property immediately. You have no credentials, no documentation, and no legitimate authority to be here making threats and demands." The attack. The transformation in the first man's demeanor was immediate and frightening. Whatever mask of professionalism he'd been trying to maintain completely dissolved, replaced by something ugly and desperate. His face flushed red with anger, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides, like someone who wasn't accustomed to being challenged or told no by anyone, especially not by a woman defending her own property. "Lady, you're making a serious mistake here," he snarled, taking several aggressive steps toward our gate. "We're not asking for your permission anymore. We're telling you that we need access to those back facilities, and you're going to provide it, whether you want to cooperate or not. This is your last chance to do this the easy way." That's when Rebecca made the decision that would change everything. She stepped directly in front of our gate and slammed it shut with a resounding clang that echoed across the ranch like a gunshot. The metal bars locked into place with finality, and she positioned herself squarely between these men and our property, with her chin raised and her shoulders back in absolute defiance. "No entry," she shouted, her voice ringing with the authority of someone protecting her own land and family. "You are not coming onto our property. You have no right to be here, no authority to make demands, and no permission to enter. Leave now, or I'm calling the sheriff." The first man's reaction was instantaneous and explosive, his face contorted with rage at being denied access, at being challenged by someone he clearly considered beneath his authority, at having his carefully planned intimidation campaign completely derailed by a woman who refused to be bullied on her own property. Without warning, without hesitation, without any regard for consequences, he raised his hand and struck Rebecca across the face with a vicious slap. The sound cracked through the afternoon air like lightning as Rebecca's head snapped sideways from the force. She stumbled backward, lost her footing on our stone steps, and fell hard against the concrete. Her temple struck the corner of our retaining wall with a sickening thud. Blood immediately began flowing from a gash as she crumpled to the ground, her eyes fluttering closed, while crimson pooled beneath her head on the walkway we'd built together. The second man immediately panicked at seeing what his partner had done. "Garrett, what the hell?" he shouted, using a name that confirmed these men knew each other personally. "You weren't supposed to actually hit anybody. This was supposed to be intimidation only. What did you just do?" My response, seeing my wife lying unconscious and bleeding on our own property because she dared to say no to trespassers, ignited something primal and unstoppable inside me. 15 years of protective instincts, college wrestling training, and ranch work strength merged into pure white-hot fury that demanded immediate action. Every rational thought vanished, replaced by the singular need to make this person pay for what he'd just done to the most important person in my world. "You son of a bitch!" I roared as I vaulted over our 4-foot gate, like it was nothing more than a minor obstacle. The first man tried to step backward, tried to raise his hands in some pathetic gesture of defense. But 15 years of pent-up rage at people who thought they could intimidate rural families had just found its target. I hit him with a tackle that would have made my old wrestling coach proud, driving my shoulder into his midsection and lifting him completely off his feet before slamming him down onto the gravel driveway with enough force to knock the wind out of his lungs. He hit the ground hard, gasping for breath, and I immediately pinned him in a wrestling hold that made it impossible for him to move or retaliate. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life." I growled into his ear as he struggled uselessly beneath my weight. "You came onto my property, you threatened my wife, and then you put your hands on her. That was assault, you piece of garbage. And now you're going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong family." The second man was backing toward their truck, clearly wanting to flee the scene entirely. But I shouted at him without releasing my grip on his partner. "Don't even think about running. I have cameras recording everything. And if you try to leave now, you'll be an accessory to assault and battery on private property. Stay right where you are." Garrett was wheezing and struggling beneath me, but the fight had gone out of him completely. The confident intimidator who'd been making threats just moments earlier was now gasping for breath and whimpering like a child who finally encountered someone stronger than himself. His cheap plastic badge had fallen off during our struggle, and it lay broken in the ground beside us like the pathetic prop it had always been. "Please," he wheezed. "I can't breathe. Let me up. We'll leave. We'll go away and never come back. Just let me up." But I wasn't finished with him yet. Not by a long shot. This person had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had committed an act of violence against the most important person in my world, and he was going to face the consequences for every second of terror and pain he'd inflicted on my family. "You're not going anywhere until the police get here," I told him, maintaining the wrestling hold that kept him immobilized on our driveway. "You wanted to play games with fake authority. Now you get to explain your actions to real authority figures who don't take kindly to the people who assault women on private property." The phone call. The afternoon air was filled with the sounds of his labored breathing, the nervous pacing of his partner near their truck, and the terrible silence from where Rebecca lay motionless on our front steps. The peaceful ranch life we built over 15 years had been shattered in the space of 30 seconds. But justice was already beginning to take shape in the form of one fake authority figure pinned helplessly in our gravel driveway. As I maintained my hold on this piece of garbage, watching his partner fumble nervously with what looked like a cell phone, I realized that our troubles were just beginning. The scared expression on the second man's face suggested he was calling for help, and something told me that whoever had sent these amateurs to intimidate us wasn't going to be happy about how spectacularly their plan had just backfired. The real question was whether they would cut their losses and disappear, or whether they would escalate this confrontation into something even more dangerous than what had already transpired on our peaceful ranch property. Either way, I was ready for whatever came next, because nobody was going to hurt my family and walk away without facing the consequences of their actions. The satisfaction of having Garrett under control lasted exactly as long as it took me to hear Kyle frantically speaking into his phone near their truck. His words carried clearly across the afternoon air, and what I heard made my blood run even colder than it already was from seeing Rebecca unconscious on our front steps. "Mr. Blackwood, we have a serious problem here," Kyle was saying, his voice shaking with panic and fear. "Garrett hit the woman, and now her husband has him down. This whole thing has gone completely sideways. We need help right now, or this is going to get much worse than we planned." Blackwood. The name hit me like a physical blow, because I knew exactly who Kyle was talking to on that phone. Vernon Blackwood, the chairman of our homeowners association, the man who'd been making life difficult for ranch families in our area for the past several years with his increasingly aggressive interpretation of property regulations. Suddenly, this wasn't just about fake compliance officers trying to scam us or intimidate us into paying some kind of bogus fine. This was personal, and it was organized, and it involved people who had real power in our community and real reasons to want our family gone from this ranch. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together in ways that made this entire situation infinitely more dangerous than I'd initially realized when these two amateurs first showed up at our gate. Garrett started the conversation with his typical arrogance, managing a weak smile despite his compromised position. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into here," he gasped. "My father isn't going to let this slide. You just assaulted the son of the most powerful man in this entire county. But as the reality of the situation sank in, I watched his confidence crumble into genuine fear. The color drained from his face as he realized that his father's influence might not be enough to protect him from the consequences of assault with injury. His father, the recognition that had been nagging at me since these men first arrived, finally clicked into place with horrible clarity. The familiar mannerisms, the particular way he held his shoulders when trying to project authority, the entitled attitude that suggested he'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Garrett was Vernon Blackwood's son, which meant this wasn't some random intimidation campaign by hired thugs. This was family business, personal vendetta disguised as official compliance work, and it explained why these amateurs had been willing to risk impersonating government officials on private property. They weren't just following orders from some distant authority figure. They were carrying out a mission that had been planned and directed by someone with intimate knowledge of our ranch, our routines, and our vulnerabilities. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching began filtering through the afternoon air, engines running hard and heading directly for our property. Kyle's phone call had clearly summoned serious reinforcements, which meant our confrontation was about to escalate from a simple case of assault and trespassing into something much more complicated and potentially dangerous for Rebecca and me. At least 3 sets of headlights were cutting through the afternoon haze, suggesting Vernon Blackwood was bringing enough people to constitute a small army of support. "You hear that," Garrett said, but his earlier confidence had evaporated into desperate bravado. "That's backup coming, and they're not going to be as patient with you as I was. You had your chance to cooperate when this could have been handled quietly." But what Garrett didn't know was that I'd been recording this entire encounter on the security camera system I'd installed after a series of equipment thefts in our area last year. Every word, every action, every moment of their intimidation campaign and his assault on my wife was being documented in high-definition video that would hold up in any court in Texas. "Actually, you arrogant piece of garbage," I said, reaching into my pocket for my phone while maintaining control of the situation. "I think you're the one who has no idea what he's gotten himself into. You see, everything that's happened here today is being recorded by multiple cameras, including your admission that your father sent you here to intimidate us." The remaining color drained completely from his face as the implications of that statement sank in. Whatever plan Vernon Blackwood had put together for dealing with our ranch, it clearly hadn't included the possibility that we would have video evidence of his son committing assault while impersonating government officials. Kyle had finished his phone call and was standing near their truck, looking increasingly desperate as he realized that their situation was rapidly spiraling beyond any hope of damage control. Instead of looking relieved at the prospect of backup arriving, he appeared to be calculating his chances of abandoning Garrett and fleeing the scene entirely. "Kyle!" Garrett called out, panic finally breaking through his voice as he realized that his partner was considering cutting his losses and running. "Don't you dare leave me here. We're in this together. And if you run now, I'll make sure my father knows exactly who is responsible for this plan falling apart." The threat was desperate and obvious, confirming what I'd already suspected about the power dynamics between these two men. Kyle was an equal partner in this conspiracy. He was expendable muscle, probably recruited with promises of easy money for a simple intimidation job that had just become a criminal assault case with video evidence and multiple witnesses. Rebecca recovers. Rebecca stirred slightly on our front steps, a small movement that sent a wave of relief through my chest. She was regaining consciousness, which meant the head injury might not be as serious as I'd initially feared. But the sight of blood still flowing from the gash on her temple kept my anger burning hot enough to maintain my position over the person who'd put her in that condition. "Rebecca," I called out without taking my eyes off Garrett. "Can you hear me? Are you okay? Don't try to move too quickly. You hit your head pretty hard when this piece of garbage knocked you down." "Nathan," her voice was weak and confused, but it was the most beautiful sound I'd heard all day. "What happened? Why does my head hurt so much? And why are you restraining someone in our driveway? This fake compliance officer decided to slap you when you refused to let him onto our property," I explained, applying pressure as a reminder of his current predicament. "He knocked you unconscious, so I'm making sure he stays right here until the real authorities arrive to sort this whole mess out." The approaching vehicles were almost at our property now, and I could see the dust clouds they were kicking up as they raced down our dirt access road. Whatever Vernon Blackwood had planned as a follow-up to his son's failed intimidation campaign, it was going to involve serious escalation from what had already transpired. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The initial shock and rage of seeing my wife assaulted had given way to cold determination and the knowledge that we had everything we needed to prove our case in court. Video evidence, witness testimony, recorded admissions of conspiracy, and a clear case of assault with injury on private property. Garrett might think his father's influence would protect him from the consequences of his actions, but he was about to learn that there were some lines you couldn't cross, even in rural Texas, where family connections and community influence carried significant weight. The real showdown was just beginning. But for the first time since these men had arrived at our ranch, I felt confident that justice was on our side. Vernon arrives. The black Mercedes that led the convoy of vehicles down our dirt road wasn't the kind of car you typically saw in our rural neighborhood. It was polished, expensive, and completely out of place among the pickup trucks and ranch equipment that normally traveled these back roads. Behind it followed two more vehicles, creating a dust storm that announced their arrival like some kind of dramatic entrance designed to intimidate anyone watching. Vernon Blackwood stepped out of the Mercedes with the calculated confidence of a man who was accustomed to having his authority respected and his commands followed without question, even at 55 years old. He carried himself like someone who'd never encountered a problem that money or influence couldn't solve. His expensive suit was immaculate despite the dusty ranch environment, and his cold eyes immediately assessed the situation with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential threats. Two other men emerged from the accompanying vehicles, both wearing cheap suits that suggested they were Vernon's enforcers rather than legitimate business associates. They positioned themselves strategically around our property perimeter, creating a tactical formation clearly designed to make Rebecca and me feel outnumbered and vulnerable on our own land. "Nathan," Vernon called out, his voice carrying false friendliness while barely concealing underlying menace. "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here today. I need you to release my son immediately so we can discuss the situation like civilized adults and resolve it without involving law enforcement unnecessarily." The audacity of his demand was breathtaking. His son had just committed assault on my wife on our private property, and Vernon was approaching the situation as if I was the one who'd done something wrong by defending my family. The entitlement was staggering, but it also confirmed everything I'd suspected about the Blackwood family's attitude toward people they considered beneath their social status. "There's no misunderstanding here, Vernon," I replied, making sure to use his first name rather than any title that might suggest respect. "Your son impersonated a government official, trespassed on my property, and assaulted my wife when she refused to let him enter our ranch. He's staying exactly where he is until the sheriff arrives." Rebecca had managed to sit up on our front steps, one hand pressed to the bleeding gash on her temple while she used our porch railing for support. The sight of her injured and struggling to remain upright, while Vernon's men surrounded our property, filled me with fresh protective rage that made it difficult to maintain my composure. Vernon's expression darkened considerably at my refusal. "You're making accusations against compliance officers who are conducting legitimate inspections under proper authority. Your assault on my son constitutes a felony attack on government personnel, and I have witnesses who will testify accordingly." The threat was clear and unmistakable. Vernon intended to use a position to turn this entire situation around, making me the criminal and his son the victim. But Vernon had made one critical mistake in his calculation. He was assuming that I would be intimidated by his threats rather than face the legal consequences of defending my family. "Actually, Vernon," I said, pulling out my phone and holding it up so he could see the active recording app, "I think you should be more concerned about the felony charges your son is going to face. Everything that happened here today is captured on my security system, including his admission that you sent him here to intimidate us." The neighbors arrive. Vernon's demeanor wavered as the implications began to register. His carefully planned intimidation campaign hadn't accounted for documented proof of his son's criminal behavior and his own involvement in orchestrating the harassment. That's when Mrs. Hartwell's pickup truck appeared on our access road, followed closely by Duncan's ranch vehicle. Within minutes, we had observers from multiple families watching the standoff unfold on our normally quiet property. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Hartwell called out as she approached, her experienced eyes taking in the scene with sharp attention. "Nathan, Rebecca, are you folks all right? And who are all these people on your property?" Vernon immediately attempted to control the narrative. "There's been an unfortunate misunderstanding during a routine compliance inspection," he announced, projecting his voice to address the gathering neighbors. "Nathan became violent when our officers attempted to conduct their duties, and we're trying to resolve this peacefully." But Duncan wasn't buying Vernon's explanation. His military background had taught him to recognize intimidation tactics, and he could clearly see that something was wrong with this entire situation. "Compliance inspection?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who wasn't easily fooled. "What agency do you represent? And where are your proper credentials and documentation?" The arrival of our neighbors had completely changed the dynamics of Vernon's carefully planned confrontation. What had started as isolated intimidation against my family had now become a public spectacle with questioners who weren't impressed by official-sounding nonsense. Kyle, who'd been growing increasingly nervous throughout this escalation, finally reached his breaking point. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic and desperation. "Nobody said anything about actual violence. I was told this would just be intimidation to make them cooperate with the HOA requirements." His outburst confirmed everything I'd suspected about Vernon's involvement in this conspiracy, and it also provided a missing piece that explained why these men had targeted our ranch specifically. This wasn't about compliance or regulations. This was about the Homeowners Association trying to force us out through illegal intimidation tactics. Vernon's face flushed red with rage at Kyle's public confession, but the damage was already done. Our neighbors had heard everything, and they were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more serious than a simple misunderstanding about property inspections. Mrs. Hartwell's expression shifted from concerned neighbor to the sharp focus of someone who'd spent 30 years working in county administration and recognized official misconduct when she saw it. "HOA requirements?" she asked, her voice taking on the tone of someone who knew exactly how homeowner associations were supposed to operate. "Since when does an HOA have authority to conduct compliance inspections with fake government officers?" Duncan stepped closer to examine Garrett, who was still under my control in the gravel driveway. "These men don't have proper badges, proper vehicles, or proper documentation. This isn't a legitimate government operation. This is harassment disguised as official business." The truth emerges. The web of Vernon's deception was unraveling in front of multiple witnesses who possessed the knowledge and experience to recognize exactly what they were seeing. Kyle's panic confession had exposed a conspiracy, and now Vernon was facing the prospect of criminal charges for organizing harassment and intimidation on private property. The real question now was how far Vernon would be willing to escalate this confrontation with our entire neighborhood watching and listening to every word that was being spoken. His son was caught red-handed, his conspiracy was exposed, and he was rapidly running out of options that didn't involve serious legal consequences for his entire operation. But I could see in Vernon's eyes that he wasn't ready to surrender yet. There was something desperate and dangerous in his expression that suggested he still had cards to play in this confrontation, and I had a feeling that the worst of the situation was still ahead of us.